Rules are one of the coolest time-saving features that is available in QuickBooks Online. And I know it might be tempting once you've set a rule up to just kind of set it and forget it. But if you're just creating rules in the bank feed and then leaving them alone, you are only scratching the surface of what rules are capable of. Not only can we train QuickBooks to recognize and classify transactions based on information in the bank text, but we can also teach it to filter by other criteria. So we can assign dollar values, we can have it meet certain ranges of information, or we can even create rules that will capture multiple different transactions all at once. So let's go ahead and dive into advanced rule creation today so that you can see where you might be able to apply this in your business and how it can save you time. So in order to get into advanced rules, we're actually going to be starting a rule from scratch. Now, if you want to know how to just create a basic rule directly from the bank feed, I will go ahead and link my video for that particular walkthrough here. But if you want to find out how you can really fine-tune your rules to pick up specific items, stay with me here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Now, to get to the rules page, we want to click on accounting here from the top menu. And then we can see rules is available right here on that left-hand navigation menu. So I'll go ahead and click on rules. Now, to create a new rule, all we have to do is go up to the very top upper right-hand corner here and say new rule. And then that side menu is going to pop out where we can create a new rule. So there is a lot here. And like I said, if you're creating rules directly in your bank transactions tab as you are adding transactions, first of all, that is phenomenal. That is something that I do not only for my own business, but for my clients. And it is a really great way to save time and to capture transactions that repeatedly come through your bank feed. But if that is all that we're doing, if we're not looking at any of the rest of these drop-down menus here, we might be missing out on some really cool features that will allow us to customize this process even more. So we're going to go ahead and start at the top. I'm just going to type in A here so that way it'll leave me alone as far as creating a name for the rule, but we'll revisit that later, okay? So we have tons of different drop-down menus here, and each one is going to allow us to create a rule that will capture a very specific thing. Now, first things first, whenever we're creating a rule, especially if we're creating it from scratch, it's important that we don't forget this first box right here. We have to tell QuickBooks whether it should apply this rule to money in or money out transactions. That is the first level of criteria that we are telling it to look for, okay? So money in is deposits, money out is withdrawals, right? Anything that goes out. So we'll leave it on money out for the time being. The next option here is telling QuickBooks which bank account we want this rule to be applied to, because you do not have to have your rules apply to all of your bank accounts. So you can select right here, you can say all bank accounts, or you can select specific bank accounts that you want the rule to apply to. Now, let's talk a little bit about a situation where you might not want a rule to apply to all of your accounts in QuickBooks Online. I used to do bookkeeping for a coffee shop that had about a half dozen different locations, and they actually had a separate checking account for each one of their locations because they wanted to be able to run a profit and loss by location and see how each and every one of those locations was doing. Having separate checking accounts made it really, really easy because if money went out of an account or was deposited into an account, it was safe to say that that expense or that income should be allocated to the checking account or to the location that that checking account belonged to. It made classification a heck of a lot easier. So I was able to say for each one of the checking accounts, I was able to create a rule for income, for example, and say that any income being deposited into that specific checking account belonged to that specific location, okay? Nice and easy, and it made the data entry process a lot easier. Same with all the outgoing though, right? When they would pay their suppliers and their vendors, they would write a check or send an ACH from the checking account that was allocated or corresponded to the location that received that delivery. Again, it just made it a lot easier. So in their particular file, I would have had multiple different rules for the same vendor. The difference would have been that each rule would be corresponding to a specific account. Okay. Now, there are transactions that might be across the board and you might not need to assign a location to. That's fine too. You can, by all means, select all bank accounts. The next line item here and the next drop down that we're going to explore is this one right here. So we've already told QuickBooks money out transactions, all bank accounts, or a specific bank account. And now we're going to look at include the following. Okay. If we say all and then proceed to have multiple sets of criteria here, QuickBooks will only apply the rule to the transaction if all of those criteria are met. So let's go ahead and talk about another example where this might come up. If I create a rule and say all, and say bank text contains Amazon, and I add a second condition and say, and the amount equals $129. What is going to happen here? Well, Amazon, or QuickBooks rather, is only going to apply this rule to that transaction if it sees a transaction come through my bank feed and the bank text says Amazon and the dollar amount is exactly $129. Now, I don't actually remember how much Amazon Prime is anymore, how much the annual subscription is, but last I remember it was about $129. So if you have a situation where there's going to be a specific transaction for a specific amount, and you want that particular transaction to be classified differently than the usual Amazon transactions that you have, you can apply multiple criteria. And if you say all, it is going to make sure that that transaction not only has Amazon in the bank text, but also is for exactly $129. Okay. Now, I don't want to sleep on some of the other options here in this grid. So right here, we only have two possible options. We have bank text or we have dollar amount. Okay. Those are the only two possible criteria or fields that we can have there. But we can have multiple layers here. So I could say, for example, instead of, I could say bank text contains, and again, we have multiple criteria here as well, bank text contains Amazon, but instead of amount equals, I might want to say amount is less than or is greater than, okay? Now, where the less than or greater than comes into play is I have companies that I work with, and they use Amazon for a lot of purchases, right? They're buying office supplies, they're buying refreshments for their office, they're doing all kinds of things, right? Well, as a general rule, they might want to apply certain criteria to certain transactions or certain dollar value transactions, right? So they might decide that anything that they purchase on Amazon that is under $100 can safely go to the office supplies expense account, whereas anything over $100 needs to be examined and we need to make sure that we have the correct expense account assigned to that. And here's why. Anything over 100 could be literally anything, right? You might have bought a printer or a computer or anything like that. Whereas anything under 100, it's safe to say they could have been buying pens, paper, toner, whatever it happens to be. So you can say that you only want the rule to apply to transactions that are less than $100, for example. Okay. You can even get more granular here. If you were to add a condition, you could say amount is less than $100 and is greater than $50, right? I can't think of an example off the top of my head where you would want to be that specific about an Amazon transaction of all things, but it is something you have the option to do. Okay. This allows you to really go in and you could pick up transactions or have this rule pick up transactions with very, very specific criteria and very specific windows of information. Okay. We've talked about the all situation, when you would want all of the criteria to be met. But let's go ahead and focus on one more thing here, as far as the is less than or is greater than, and where I might actually use this particular type of criteria in the real world. I have a client who has an insurance provider, and they use that insurance provider for both general liability insurance and for auto insurance for their fleet of vehicles. Okay. The auto insurance is always more than $7,000 a month. Okay. That is just a rule. I have never ever seen it be less than that. So I actually created a rule in their system that picked up their insurer's name in the bank text and under amount said is greater than $7,000. And I have told QuickBooks that anytime that transaction comes up, it goes to auto insurance. Okay. Now, that same company provides their general liability insurance. Well, their general liability insurance has never been more than $5,000 a month. So I put bank text contains their liability insurance or their insurance provider's name, and then amount is less than $5,000. And then that picks it up and puts it to general liability insurance. So you can see where we can use these rules to parse out transactions that might be coming in from the same vendor for multiple different purposes or reasons. All right, we're going to go ahead and delete a couple of these here just to get this back to reasonable. But you can have multiple conditions. I think you can have, let's just actually give it a try here. I believe you can have, up to 5 conditions. Now, that has actually changed in the recent past. It used to be that you could have 10 conditions. They've started to kind of whittle that down. I believe it went down to 6 for a while. Now we are down to 5. So you might be looking at this and thinking, well, gosh, I can't think of any reason why I might want to have a rule with more than 2 or 3 criteria. What on earth am I going to do with a rule that has 5 or more criteria? Well, here's where this gets really, really fun. Remember, we don't have one option here. We have 2. So if you have all, the transaction has to meet all of the criteria that you outline in order for QuickBooks to apply the rule. But you can actually select any. And if you select any, then QuickBooks will classify the transaction based on any of the criteria being met. So what are some instances where we might want to actually go ahead and create a rule like this? Well, one of the big examples that comes to mind, at least for me and that I use for my clients, is gas stations. Okay, I have a construction company that I work with. They have a fleet of vehicles, and all of their guys have credit cards so that they can be putting gas in the trucks at all times. Well, they do jobs all over the place, okay? They might be going out into the middle of nowhere to Joe's gas station, which they are never going to visit again. So, do I want to create a rule for each and every Joe's gas station out there? Or do I want to create one rule that can capture multiple gas stations and get it all classified at once? Well, I've opted to go that route because it makes the data entry so much easier and it keeps our vendor and customer center from getting bogged down. We don't necessarily want to create a new vendor for every single gas station that's visited. It doesn't make sense. So here's what we can do. We can actually say bank text contains and then enter multiple different criteria. So I might say Chevron and then Shell and Arco and Love's and 76, right? Those might be the gas stations that I know people are going to be going to all of the time. If I say any and then put all of these criteria in, it is going to pick up, if any one of those is in the bank text, it's going to pick this rule up and apply it to the transaction. So what do I want to do from there if I have this kind of rule that might capture multiple transactions? Well, we still have more that we haven't gotten to down here at the bottom. I would want to first make sure, yes, this is an expense. The category would be fuel. And then the payee, I do recommend that you always put a payee in if it is an option. option. Again, you don't necessarily want to create a new vendor for every single thing. So if there are items like gas stations where you might not be visiting the same one over and over and over again, it is perfectly okay to create an overarching umbrella vendor just called gas stations, for example, or restaurants or coffee shops or whatever it happens to be, so that these do have a payee associated with them, okay? So I believe that I do already have gas stations in here, and I do. So I can basically have this rule pick up any transaction that comes through my bank transactions tab that has one of these in the bank text. And it's then going to automatically apply gas stations as the payee and fuel as the expense. So you can see where if you have 10 or 15 employees who are all out on their own trucks doing things, this rule could save you a ton of time when it comes to data entry, okay? Couple more things that I want to draw your attention to in this rules screen in general, okay? First, this is actually something somewhat new that QuickBooks has just rolled out when it comes to creating rules. You can see right here, we have priority. What does this mean? Well, basically, QuickBooks, and you can kind of see this kind of in the grayed out section of my screen here. When you create rules, QuickBooks automatically places any new rule that you create all the way at the bottom of your rules list. And odds on, the longer you have a file, the longer you're working in it, the more rules you're going to have. I have clients who have hundreds of rules on their books, okay? Because maybe they've had their QuickBooks file for 10, 15, 20 years, and all of that institutional data has just continued to flow forward, okay? If that is the case, you might find that I'm on rule 40, and this is just a sample file. This isn't even an actual company file. This is one that is literally just for training and illustration purposes, and I have 40 rules in this. Imagine what I have for clients that have actual transactions, actual volume flowing through their books at any given time. So here is where priority is important. Priority means that it's basically the order of operations that QuickBooks is going to apply rules in. So if I want a rule to be high priority, I have to tell QuickBooks that. So you can see right here, I actually have a rule back here that says gas station 1, okay? And it has some information in there already. If I don't want to step on that rule's toes, for example, I might want to make sure that this rule that I've created is farther back than rule number 3, okay? So I might call this rule gas station 2. And at that point, I would want to make sure that it is at least 4 or lower. Now it's 40. Maybe I don't want to leave it all the way at 40. Maybe I do want to put it at 4 directly behind gas station 1. Okay. And that is something that you would want to assess. Now, there's not a lot of examples that come to mind off the top of my head about where the priority thing is really critical when it comes to rules. Okay. The ones that I can think of are where you might want QuickBooks to look for a bank text and then a certain dollar amount before it starts looking for other dollar amounts. But at the end of the day, if you have one rule that says this bank text and this particular dollar amount, it's likely going to apply that just fine. So the priority is really just more about trying to make sure that you're not going to have to go back and adjust rules at a later time if you create new rules that might not be that you might not want to be applied first, or that you might want to be applied later, okay? The final thing here, and this is again a new feature that QuickBooks has rolled out in the recent past, is it used to just be that you could assign the rule and that was it. They have now added the option to exclude the transaction. Now, here's the thing about that. If you have a bank feed established and the transaction is coming through, I can't think of a lot of examples of when you would want to exclude a transaction. I've had some one-off weird things happen when it comes to bank feeds. For example, I went to a restaurant once for my business and I ran my card there. I put it in, did the tip, did all that. And for whatever reason, the bank put through multiple charges on the card. Now, those charges had not actually happened. I had one charge for that restaurant and that was it. But the bank feed pulled through multiple instances of the same transaction, okay? That being said, that was a one-off event and I immediately caught it and excluded those transactions. My account reconciled, I moved on with my life. That was it. It was a very straightforward situation. The only other times that I usually will see people excluding transactions is if you had your bank feed break for some reason, and then when it was reestablished, there were a couple of transactions that overlapped that had already been added, but then were brought through again when you reestablished the bank feed. But those are, again, kind of strange one-off instances. That's not necessarily something where you could apply a rule to that situation. Now, there is something to be said for maybe if you're creating rules for transfers that happen between accounts, maybe you only want one side of that to come through on your bank transactions tab. But QuickBooks has made strides as far as offering up the option to pair those transactions together, thereby cutting down on the likelihood that you'll accidentally create two parallel transactions that cross right past each other. So, again, I'm having a hard time personally coming up with a reason why you might want to exclude a transaction with a rule. That being said, if you have one or if you think of one, please do leave that in the comments because I would love to hear what people are doing with this exclude feature. As a general rule, we are going to assign, and again, you want to be sure that you're putting in that category and that payee. Final two things here. First, I generally check this box that says also keep existing bank memo because I don't necessarily want to overwrite the bank memo with whatever was in that field when I created this rule. Since I'm creating a rule from scratch here, we can see that there is nothing there, right? But if I was creating a rule from my bank feed, there might be information here. And I might not want that information to then be overwritten onto all future transactions. On top of that, there's one last thing right here, which is auto post right down here at the very, very bottom. As a general rule, I turn off auto post for my rules when I first create them, and here is why. If you leave auto post on, here is what's going to happen. That rule is immediately going to go into effect when you hit save. Then your transactions are going to continue to flow through your bank feed. They flow through in close to real time, usually with a 24 to 48 hour delay. So let's say that a transaction hits your account tomorrow that this rule captures. If you have auto add turned on, that transaction is immediately going to be pulled from your bank transactions tab and into your bank register, meaning that it's showing up on your reports. While that is not a bad thing if your rule is acting as you want it to, I generally recommend turning off auto post until you have watched the rule function once or twice to make sure that it actually is being applied the way that you want it to, okay? It is always easier to adjust rules when you see them applied in the bank transactions tab than it is to try to track down all of the transactions that a rule was applied to after the fact when they've just been auto added onto your books, okay? So that is basically advanced rule creation. There is a ton here. You can do so much with this section. I highly recommend going in and playing around with rule creation because you'll see there are so many different ways that you can customize this out to save you even more time and energy when it comes to classifying your transactions. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Holly from Accrual Mistress Bookkeeping and Consulting. If you have any questions, please do leave those in the comments below. And please don't forget to like and subscribe so you'll be notified when more videos are up.